we are also seeing articles saying like, oh, bring yourself to work, bring your whole self to, all that kind of thing, right? So I guess I want to start off with, what is the definition of self that you have arrived at? And if you have a metaphor to represent it.
Maybe let's start with the definition and then we'll get to the metaphor. The way I think about the self is, it links back to something that Walt Whitman wrote about in one of his great poems, Song of Myself. There's a bit of it where he says, do I contradict myself? Yes, I do, right? Very well then, I contradict myself, but I am large, I contain multitudes. And that for me is what the self is, right? The self is all about containing multitudes and realizing that as much as the outer universe is huge and has planets and galaxies and universes in it, the inner self is also just as large if you know how to plumb all of its depths. So for me, it's all about containing multitudes. And the multitudes are what I mentioned earlier, right? The primordial identities that we have, right? Our race, our ethnicity, our religion, the language we speak, the history and culture that we come from. But it's also about the interests that we have, the disciplines that we learn from, the things we learn about along the way, even if we didn't study them early on, the things we're interested to read, the things that we might be learning about from other people. And when you put those together, I start realizing that those multitudes are what make us interesting, because they're always going to be points of connection to others. And what's also interesting is the multitudes don't stay static. You asked me about a metaphor, right?
Yeah.
These days, I find that most of life, right, we need to find living metaphors for them. Sometimes when we look for metaphors, we end up looking for metaphors in the wrong places. Sometimes we think of organizations as machines, for example, or you could think of yourself, right, as something more static, right? You could talk about the self being a receptacle, for instance. We have that image in learning, the empty vessel makes the most noise. And so somehow the learning process fills the vessel, right? But what a static way of thinking about the self.
It's terrible.
It's terrible, exactly. Because, we don't just get filled, right? We fill ourselves, we grow from the process. We don't stay the same after having learned. And so the metaphor I like most nowadays is the metaphor of any kind of ecology, right? A garden in particular. I think if you think of yourself as a garden, then the self becomes so much more wide-ranging in its possibilities. Because so first of all, it changes, right? It's growing. It is probably untidy at the edges. And there are going to be different parts of it that are critical at different times. A garden is going to have trees in it. It's going to have other plants. It's going to have animals, all kinds of flora and fauna. But you can bring other things into it, right? You can bring garden gnomes into it, right? You can bring a little statuette, a turtle or something. I look at my mother's garden, for instance, and how it's grown. And it's so different now from what it was 10 years ago. So I think capturing the dynamism, capturing the growth, capturing the evolutionary nature of the self is really important, actually. Because if we don't get to grips with the diverse selves that we are, right, our diversities, not just our diversity, then I think it's hard to even think about what communities might be, because communities are made up of these complex, dynamic, growing individuals.
I mean, as I'm listening to you speak, like, it reminds me of a time when I was going for a coaching program, and that it was in Europe, and I had some time to just walk around. And I found myself wandering into a forest nearby. And that's when I started to develop like this picture in my mind of like walking into a forest is kind of like how I want to see the work of coaching or facilitating with a person or a group of persons, right? It feels almost like I need to walk into a nature reserve or a forest, right? Like I want to walk into a person's self with the same respect that I would walk into like an ancient forest that needs to be preserved, right? And there are certain paths that have been told to me in advance that are good and safe and protective to take. And I must walk in and not leave anything behind.
Right. And not take anything.
And not take anything, right?
Yeah.
And also like to notice that there might, on the forest floor, there might be things that have passed on or that have died. And yet at the same time, there's great growth.
Yep.
Yeah. And
some of the nourishment comes from what has died.
That's right. Yep. That's right. And to like look at that and respect that. And I walked out of that forest with this strange feeling of like, That's a metaphor I'm going to sit with for a very long time.
I love it. I think it's a great metaphor. Yeah, and one of the reasons I love it is because it's a living metaphor. Yeah, right. It captures the fact that we're not static creatures. We are forever growing and changing. And like you say, some things will die. Sometimes we prune in order to grow further later on. And that process of uncreating and recreating is also part of this endless evolutionary cycle.